Have you ever had a neighbor so nosy you'd swear they knew what you had for breakfast before you'd even decided yourself? Stick around, because if you've endured a homeowners association busybody, this story is about to validate all your frustrations. And if you haven't, consider this your fair warning of what can happen when one self-appointed HOA warrior takes things way, way too far. I still remember the day I signed the papers on my suburban house with starry-eyed optimism. The property was perfect. A half-acre lot with a quaint, single-story ranch and enough space for a garden. Not to mention it was supposedly in a quiet, close-knit community, or so I was told. I'd seen the typical HOA rules in the documents. No loud parties after 10 p.m., keep your trash cans hidden, and so on. Nothing I couldn't handle. Little did I know that behind those guidelines stood a woman determined to interpret them to her own advantage and barge into every detail of my personal space in the process. I should start by clarifying that I'm not a rebel. I don't host wild parties, I don't collect strange animals, and I have no problem mowing my lawn according to schedule. I'm just a retired teacher who wanted a cozy spot to grow strawberries, play with my old Labrador named Winston, and maybe tinker with a few woodworking projects. But apparently, to my new neighbor Karen, being quiet and minding my own business wasn't sufficient. She seemed to relish enforcing every rule with the fervor of a border guard, but not just the official rules. She had her own unwritten code, and she was determined to make everyone comply with her personal brand of order. We first crossed paths a week after I moved in. My next-door neighbor, who ironically introduced herself as Karen from the HOA, came striding across the lawn with the confidence of a drill sergeant. She spotted me unloading a new lawnmower from my car and marched right over. Karen was an average-height woman in her mid-50s, sporting a no-nonsense haircut and a piercing glare that could curdle milk. Before she even said hello, she picked up the cardboard packaging I'd left near the curb and frowned. You know, she began in a tone that suggested she was doing me a tremendous favor. The rules say we don't leave large items out on the sidewalk. It's an eyesore for the neighborhood. She tilted her head, waiting for me to stammer an apology, but I just nodded politely. I'm planning to break it down and put it in the recycling bin, I explained. I literally just got here from the hardware store. That was the end of our first interaction, although she lingered a moment longer, as if expecting me to beg her forgiveness. I didn't, and she trotted off with a clipped, "Welcome to the neighborhood," thrown over her shoulder. I shrugged it off, attributing her abruptness to typical HOA sternness. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Over the following weeks, Karen's helpful reminders ramped up to daily visits. She'd appear at the end of my driveway when I was weeding, letting me know how far back from the sidewalk I was required to maintain the hedge. When I installed a tasteful wind chime on the back porch, she materialized, complaining it could disturb the soundscape after 9 p.m. It didn't matter that the chime was behind my house, barely audible at best. It became clear Karen considered herself a personal gatekeeper of the entire block. Things took a turn for the bizarre one warm Saturday morning. Winston and I had spent half the day planting bright marigolds around the border of our yard. I was sweaty, covered in dirt, and extremely proud of my progress. That's when Karen traipsed over, scanning the yard as though searching for an infraction. Her gaze landed on the marigolds, and her disapproval was immediate. "You know, we typically stick to neutral-tone flowers out front," she said. "Those marigolds are a bit vibrant." I almost choked on my water bottle. "Vibrant? They're just flowers, Karen." No one said anything about them needing to be neutral-toned. She puffed her chest out, arms folded tightly. "Well, it's in the HOA guidelines to maintain aesthetic harmony. We strive for consistent appearances." I raised an eyebrow. I read the guidelines front to back, and I don't recall any mention of color restrictions on flowers. Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't back down. It's an unspoken standard. Everyone else keeps their yard decor tasteful and subdued. She glanced at Winston, who was gnawing on a squeaky toy. "And that dog." I didn't let her finish. "Look, Winston is old and sleeps 16 hours a day. He's hardly disturbing the peace." Karen drew in a breath, then plastered on a tight-lipped smile. "I'm just trying to help you fit in. You might want to consider how you're impacting the community." With that, she marched back across the lawn, leaving me stewing. I was still processing that strange conversation when I realized she had another bullet point on her agenda. She was eyeing my side gate that led into my backyard. I noticed she was trying to peek over the fence, presumably to see if I had any violations out of sight. That day, I learned an important lesson. Karen's curiosity didn't end at property lines. And soon, her unstoppable sense of entitlement would lead her to do the unthinkable. Insist on stepping inside my home. No invitation required. At that point, I had no idea she'd eventually go so far as to dial 911 just to assert her so-called authority. But I was about to get a front-row seat to the extremes one person could reach when they believe the entire neighborhood was their kingdom. Keep reading to find out how a simple Saturday of yard work escalated into a legal fiasco, and how I nearly ended up handcuffed in my own living room. A few days after the Marigold incident, I attended my first HOA meeting, more out of curiosity than any genuine desire to be involved. If Karen was as vocal with everyone else as she was with me, I wanted to see how the broader community reacted. Would they cower under her watchful eye or share my exasperation? The meeting took place in our local community center, a modest brick building with enough chairs for about 30 people. I recognized a few faces from my block, but Karen was nowhere to be seen when I arrived. I settled into a folding chair near the back, next to an older couple who introduced themselves as Jerry and Marcia. They offered me a friendly nod and whispered that they were also fairly new here. 3 years, which by the look of things, still made them newcomers in a neighborhood where some families had lived for decades. As the meeting kicked off, various board members droned on about budget allocations for landscaping and minor clubhouse repairs. Nothing particularly riveting. I was half listening and half wondering if this was a colossal waste of my evening. Then, as if summoned by my thoughts, Karen burst through the door in a flurry of urgency. She made a beeline for the front, apologizing, only half-heartedly, for her tardiness. It seemed her real regret was missing the opportunity to dictate the conversation from the get-go. I quickly learned that Karen was not just a member of the HOA. She was the self-appointed enforcer. The actual HOA president was a genial older man named Dave, who seemed far more concerned with community picnics and holiday lights than borderline flower colors. Yet, from the moment Karen arrived, she seized the spotlight. She raised issues about excessive wind chimes, unauthorized lawn ornaments, and, believe it or not, inconsistent mailbox aesthetics. I could feel my blood pressure rising each time she used the word unsightly. Jerry and Marcia exchanged eye rolls with me, and I realized they too were fed up with her theatrics. During the open forum, Karen actually singled me out. We have a new resident who's begun planting bright orange marigolds. They, clash with the community's subdued landscaping palette. She scanned the room, waiting for backup. I stood, clearing my throat. I wasn't thrilled to be in the spotlight, but I refused to be shamed. I've looked at our covenants, and there's no official rule against marigolds or bright colors in general. If there's a color theme, it's certainly not documented. Dave, the HOA president, glanced at me and nodded. He's correct, Karen. We haven't discussed any specific color restrictions for flower beds. Let's keep this meeting on track for items we've actually voted on. He gently reminded her that personal preferences can't override written rules. Karen's face twitched with frustration, but she forced a smile. Of course, Dave. Just wanted to maintain, harmony. With that, she sat down but spent the rest of the meeting glaring in my direction. Little did I know that my refusal to yield to Karen's whimsical standards had sparked a simmering feud. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed her passing by my house more often, sometimes pausing to scribble something on a clipboard she carried around. She made a show of peering into my yard, probably hoping to catch me doing something forbidden. While it was annoying, I tried to ignore it. I had known that an HOA would come with a certain level of oversight. I just hadn't bargained for a personal micromanager. But the day finally came when Karen's prying eyes weren't satisfied with just scanning my yard. That morning, I was inside, taking a break from building a cedar bench in my garage workshop. I had a fresh cup of coffee in hand, savoring the calm, when the doorbell rang. Winston, my loyal Labrador, let out a half-hearted bark, more out of habit than actual ferocity. I opened the door, and there stood Karen, wearing a bright pink sweater and a smug grin. She held her clipboard against her chest like a shield of righteousness. "Morning," she greeted, stepping forward as if expecting me to just move aside and let her in. I didn't budge. "Something I can help you with?" Karen pursed her lips. "I'd like to perform an inspection of the interior, just to ensure you're abiding by the community guidelines." I nearly choked on my coffee. Inspection? On the inside? That's not in any HOA covenant I've ever read. She pressed her lips together in a thin line. "We have a provision that the board can inspect properties to ensure compliance with health and safety standards." I leaned against the doorframe. "Health and safety? The only potential hazard in here is my messy workbench. And if the HOA had that authority, don't you think it would have been in the official documents?" Her eyebrows arched, suggesting she was used to people rolling over for her. "I have the right to confirm you're not storing chemicals or anything else that could violate our environmental guidelines. If you have a workshop, that's even more reason to check." I shook my head. "I'm not comfortable with that. If you have legitimate concerns, you can bring them to the board, and they can set up a formal inspection with proper notice. But you personally don't have the right to barge in." Karen sniffed, clearly flustered. "Fine. Let's see how the board feels about your refusal." She turned on her heel and stomped off, leaving me both irritated and somewhat amused. Who did she think she was? A self-appointed code enforcer with X-ray vision? But as I watched her storm away, I had an uneasy feeling. Karen was relentless, and if she believed I was hiding something like illegal marigolds, no doubt, she wouldn't hesitate to escalate. Sure enough, that's exactly what she did. The next morning, I found a note taped to my door. Heavy stock paper with the HOA letterhead. "We have received a complaint about potential hazardous materials on your property. We request access for inspection within 7 days." It was signed not just by Karen, but also by Dave, the HOA president. My stomach twisted in annoyance. Karen was obviously behind this, but the fact that Dave had co-signed meant I couldn't just ignore it. I called Dave immediately, hoping to sort this out like rational adults. He answered on the second ring, and after exchanging pleasantries, I got straight to the point. "Look, Dave, I'm not storing any hazardous materials. Karen's been breathing down my neck ever since she found out I do woodworking. She's fishing for infractions." Dave sighed. "Yeah, I figured something like that might be going on. But you have to understand, if someone files a formal complaint, I'm obligated to follow up. Legally, we can't ignore a claim about potential hazards." I pressed my lips together, reminding myself to keep calm. "So what does this inspection entail?" "Typically, we'd have someone from the board, along with maybe a volunteer from the community, come by and check your garage or workshop for anything that violates code. That's it. It's a quick look. We don't rummage through your house. We don't open drawers. We're looking for flammable chemicals, or a stockpile of fireworks, or anything that's actually dangerous." He added more quietly, "Karen shouldn't have tried to do it alone. That's not protocol." "Yeah, she certainly did," I said with a mirthless chuckle. "All right, Dave, I'll cooperate. But I want you to be there, and I do not want Karen going anywhere near my place unless you're with her." Dave promised to handle it, and we scheduled an inspection for the upcoming Thursday afternoon. I tried not to let it bother me too much, but the situation gnawed at me all week. My brand new sense of serenity in this neighborhood was crumbling because of one woman's meddling. I busied myself prepping the garage, lining up my woodworking materials so that everything looked as harmless as possible, which it was, of course. I had nothing to hide, but that didn't stop me from feeling indignant. Thursday finally arrived, and I waited in my driveway, Winston panting at my side. A black SUV rolled up, and Dave stepped out alongside another board member named Kelly, who I recognized from the meeting. Karen was nowhere in sight, which was a relief. Kelly gave me a friendly wave, and Dave approached with a half-apologetic grin. "Karen's at some conference for work," he explained, before adding Riley, or so she said. I'm guessing she didn't want to be here for the boring part. I showed them into my garage, and the inspection took all of 5 minutes. Kelly checked for any labeled hazardous materials, but all I had were a few cans of standard wood stain and a small container of paint thinner, stored properly in a locked cabinet. Dave noted it all on a clipboard, politely thanked me for my cooperation, and told me I had nothing to worry about. "Sorry again for the trouble," Kelly said as they left. "You know how some folks get carried away?" "Some more than others," I agreed, shaking both their hands. With that, it seemed the matter was resolved. at least officially. For the next week, life returned to a semblance of normal. I resumed my routine, walking Winston in the mornings, woodworking, tending my little marigold plot, and sipping iced tea on the porch in the evenings. Despite Karen's best efforts, I still love the neighborhood's lush tree-lined streets and the gentle hum of cicadas at dusk. But Karen was like a bad rash. You might think it's gone, only for it to flare up worse than before. I was loading a bag of potting soil into the trunk of my car one afternoon when I heard her voice behind me. She was talking with another neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, a kind elderly gentleman who kept to himself, and I could tell from her tone that she was scolding him about something. The look on Mr. Rodriguez's face was pure frustration. It was clear Karen's reign of terror extended well beyond me. She caught sight of me and ended her lecture abruptly, hustling over as though she had urgent news. "I see you had the inspection," she said with a tight smile. "No violations found, I hear. Congratulations." "Thanks," I replied, barely looking up from my trunk. "I was just about to stop by to check on that leftover paint thinner you had." She gave me a pointed look, as if expecting me to flinch. I exhaled slowly. "Karen, the board did the inspection. You don't need to check anything." She stuck her nose in the air. "The board might be satisfied, but I'm not entirely convinced. You should know some people in this neighborhood actually appreciate my thoroughness. They like that I keep things safe, right?" I muttered, biting back a retort. She gave me one more measuring glance before walking away, clipboard in hand, presumably off to find another unsuspecting neighbor to torment. What I didn't realize then was that Karen's next inspection attempt wouldn't stop at the garage, and it would involve a call to the police. Her vendetta against me, fueled by her illusions of authority, was about to escalate in a way that would leave me speechless. Saturday dawned bright and breezy, the perfect weather for a little backyard barbecue. I'd invited a couple of old friends from my teaching days, Linda and Tom, to stop by around noon. They were eager to see my new place, meet Winston, and catch up over some grilled burgers. I spent the morning prepping homemade potato salad and setting up my grill under a big, shady oak tree. By 11, Linda and Tom arrived, bearing a platter of brownies. We laughed and swapped stories about the latest gossip from our old school, thrilled to be in a peaceful environment away from the daily grind. That peace was short-lived. As the coals heated, Linda and Tom were admiring the way I'd arranged my small vegetable garden in neat raised beds, chatting about the tomatoes and cucumbers I'd started. Then, through the slats of the wooden fence, I spotted a familiar figure. Karen was skulking around the side gate, fiddling with the latch as if testing whether it was locked. Anger flared in my chest. "Hold on," I told Linda and Tom. I strode across the lawn to the gate. "Karen, can I help you with something?" She jumped slightly, then put on a falsely sweet smile. "Oh, I was just, making sure you have the right lock on your fence gate. The board recently sent out guidelines for approved hardware." I folded my arms. "No, they didn't. And even if they had, you don't open my gate without permission." She raised her chin defiantly. "I wasn't opening it, just checking to see if it was secure. Children sometimes play in the neighborhood, and we wouldn't want them wandering into a workshop full of dangerous tools." I couldn't help but scoff. I don't have children near my workshop, and I doubt anyone's forcing their way into my private property. I gave her a pointed look. "Except you." Karen's eyes narrowed. For a moment, she looked ready to snap back, but she just cleared her throat. "Well, I'm only ensuring the safety of the community. You may not appreciate it, but it's for your own good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other errands." She turned and hurried off, her posture stiff with indignation. I locked the gate firmly and walked back to my friends, shaking my head. "Sorry about that. That's Karen. She's the self-proclaimed sheriff around here." Linda's eyebrows rose. "She really tried to open your gate?" Tom whistled. "I'd heard of HOA nightmares, but this is next level." We brushed it off and got back to our afternoon. We managed to enjoy a lovely meal, and for a while, Karen's intrusion was just an odd anecdote we could laugh about. That changed when Linda and Tom left around 4, and I found myself tidying up the yard. Winston trotted contentedly beside me, sniffing at every leftover scent from the afternoon's festivities. As I carried a bag of trash around to the side of the house, I spotted a flash of pink near my front door. My heart sank. Karen was back, rummaging in my mailbox. She had the small metal door open and was flipping through my letters with barely disguised curiosity. It was too much. I dropped the trash bag and hurried over. "What are you doing?" I demanded, slamming the mailbox shut. She nearly dropped my mail in surprise. Karen recovered her composure quickly. "We've had a rash of incorrectly delivered mail. I was just checking to see if you got any of my letters by mistake." I clenched my jaw. "And you think it's okay to go through my mailbox?" She shrugged as if it was no big deal. "We're neighbors. I'm just trying to help ensure everyone's getting the right mail." I could feel my patience slipping. "Help or not, it's illegal to tamper with someone else's mailbox. Stay out of it." She tossed her hair, seemingly unbothered by my anger. "Fine, but don't act surprised if your mail keeps getting mixed up. Have a good day." She stormed off, not even bothering to look back. I stood there, fist-balled. Her constant boundary crossing was more than annoying. It was downright creepy. Neighbors might borrow sugar or keep an eye out for deliveries when you're on vacation, but rifling through someone's mailbox is a line you don't cross. I vowed right then and there to put a stop to this nonsense. Unfortunately, Karen was several steps ahead. Before I even had a chance to lodge a complaint with the board, she found a brand new excuse to inspect my property. This time, she claimed a strong chemical smell was emanating from my house, implying I was cooking up hazardous substances inside. It was absurd. My home smelled like furniture polish at worst, from the occasional wood stain. But in Karen's mind, it was enough grounds for her to do what she'd wanted all along: weasel her way inside. When I saw her marching up my driveway the following Wednesday, I decided enough was enough. I refused to even open the door. She banged on it for a full minute, yelling for me to let her in so she could confirm I wasn't creating a public health hazard. I locked the deadbolt and went to stand in the kitchen, arms crossed, heart pounding with anger. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable ring of 911 being dialed on a phone. I peered through the peephole, and sure enough, Karen had her cell phone pressed to her ear. My stomach dropped. She was calling the police. Over what? Refusing her entry? She mumbled something into the phone, glancing periodically at my door with self-righteous triumph. This was about to get real. I'll be honest. The moment I heard Karen call 911, my heart hammered with a mix of fear and fury. This wasn't some mild annoyance anymore. She was involving law enforcement because I wouldn't let her trespass. It was so ludicrous that I almost laughed, until I realized how serious the consequences could be if the police showed up expecting a dangerous situation. I debated whether to open the door and try to talk some sense into her, but quickly decided against it. Karen lived in her own reality, and confrontation might only escalate things. Instead, I waited. Sure enough, about 15 minutes later, I heard the wail of sirens approaching. Then 2 police cruisers rolled down my street. My nerves spiked. I glanced out the window to see a small group of neighbors gathering, drawn by the commotion. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the scene. Karen ran to them with theatrical flair, gesturing wildly at my house. I couldn't hear her exact words, but I saw the expressions on their faces shift from concern to something resembling confusion, like they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. One officer approached my door, while the other hung back, likely getting Karen's side of the story. I took a deep breath and opened my front door, Winston standing alert by my side. The officer lifted a hand in a calming gesture. "Sir, we received a call about a possible hazardous situation. Could you tell us what's going on?" My jaw clenched. "Yes, officer, I can. The woman who called, Karen, she's my neighbor and also part of our HOA. She's been harassing me, trying to enter my property without consent. Today, she demanded to come in because she claims there's some sort of chemical smell. I refused. She called 911. The second officer joined us, presumably after listening to Karen's rant. She says you're cooking something dangerous inside, some kind of chemical concoction that could be a health hazard," he said, looking me in the eye to gauge my reaction. I let out an exasperated sigh. "The only thing cooking in here is the stew I made for dinner. Feel free to come in, under your authority, not hers, and take a quick look around. I have nothing to hide." At this point, I just wanted the officers to see how absurd this was so they could put it to rest. The first officer hesitated. "Are you sure you're okay with that, sir?" Yes, I replied, stepping aside. I'd rather prove her wrong than continue this drama. The last thing I wanted was Karen to spin any more wild tales about me barricading dangerous chemicals inside. The officers entered, and Winston followed, tail wagging politely. I led them through the living room and into the kitchen, where my modest stew bubbled on the stove. The air smelled of tomatoes, onions, and a touch of garlic, hardly the stench of illegal chemicals. One officer peered around the corners, and the other asked a few questions. Do you have any recent deliveries of chemicals? Any stored fuel or paint thinners? I answered truthfully, pointing out that any such items were in my locked garage cabinet, which had already been inspected by the HOA board a week prior. Satisfied, they nodded. We headed back outside, where Karen stood waiting, her arms folded. The officers exchanged glances, and then one turned to her. Ma'am, we found no evidence of any hazardous activity. The smell is from a normal household meal. We recommend you resolve any HOA concerns through the proper channels. This is not a police matter. Karen's face reddened, and she pressed her lips into a thin line. But he refused to let me inside when I have a right to ensure the community's safety. The officer cut her off gently, but firmly. He does not have to let you inside, ma'am. You don't have law enforcement authority. If there's a legitimate issue, you notify the appropriate authorities or follow HOA procedure. This isn't an emergency. I had to bite back a grin at the sight of Karen being so thoroughly shut down. She sputtered something about neglecting community responsibilities, but the officers simply reminded her that calling 911 for non-emergency reasons is a serious matter. They were polite, but clearly annoyed. One cruiser left, while the second officer lingered to file an incident report. Karen watched from the curb, her eyes practically shooting daggers at me. As the second officer finished taking down my statement, he leaned in a bit, lowering his voice. Off the record, you might want to consider a restraining order or at least a formal complaint. This kind of harassment has a way of escalating. I thanked him for his advice, shut the door, and leaned against it, exhaling. My pulse was still racing, but I also felt a wave of relief. The police had seen her behavior for what it was, intrusive and baseless. Karen's big call to 911 had backfired, exposing her tactics to the entire neighborhood. Yet in the pit of my stomach, I sensed this wasn't the end of it. Sure enough, Karen wouldn't take this public rebuke lying down. She had lost the battle, but in her mind, the war was still raging. And her next move would make it painfully clear that she had every intention of doubling down on her campaign against me. In the aftermath of the 9/11 incident, the gossip mill churned at full speed. Neighbors approached me during evening dog walks or while I was watering my flowers, wanting to know the real story. Most expressed sympathy. It seemed Karen's constant patrolling and petty complaints had ruffled more than a few feathers around here. A couple of folks even admitted they were afraid to speak up because they didn't want Karen making trouble for them. Despite the relief that many in the neighborhood sided with me, I couldn't shake off the unease. Karen, humiliated by the police visit, now appeared to be on a relentless crusade to reinforce her status as the ultimate HOA authority. She circulated a new newsletter in which she wrote a strongly worded piece about community safety vigilance, advising residents to report suspicious odors or unauthorized modifications immediately. The language was vague, but everyone knew who she was targeting. My friend Linda, the one who came for the barbecue, had a contact in local real estate. She discovered that Karen had a track record. 6 or 7 years ago, she'd been on the board of another HOA in a nearby town. Rumors had it she left after inciting a string of lawsuits over minor covenant violations, garden gnomes, mismatched curtains, and so forth. It was no wonder she was so brazen. She'd been doing this for years, pushing boundaries until people either submitted or lawyered up. I mulled over my options. The idea of a restraining order sounded dramatic, but I was tired of living under her surveillance. Maybe an official complaint to the HOA board could rein her in. After all, Dave and Kelly had seemed reasonable. If enough neighbors joined forces, perhaps we could push Karen out of her unofficial role of enforcement officer. That's when I found the letter in my mailbox. It was printed on crisp white paper, bearing the words "Official Notice of Noncompliance." It cited random sections from the HOA guidelines about property upkeep, suggesting that my unapproved garden structures, the wooden trellises for my climbing beans, and excessive noise, my old lawnmower, apparently, were subject to fines if not remedied within 14 days. It was signed not by Dave, not by Kelly, but by Karen, head of the HOA Compliance Committee. I rubbed my temples. Compliance Committee? She was inventing titles now? Knowing this had gone too far, I dialed Dave's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried Kelly's, same result. Odd. Eventually, I discovered they were both out of town for a weekend HOA leadership conference. Karen had chosen her moment well. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on my porch. I peeked out the window to see Karen's pink sweater. My stomach churned. Another face-off was the last thing I wanted, but ignoring her might embolden her further. I opened the door a crack, Winston at my side. She held up a clipboard. "I trust you've seen the notice." I nodded coolly. "I have, and I don't recognize your authority to issue fines. Dave and the board handle that." Karen gave a smug smile. "Dave delegated certain responsibilities to me while he's away. This is one of them. If you don't fix your violations, the fines will accumulate daily." Exasperation flared in my voice. "My garden trellises? Seriously? People in this neighborhood have swing sets, pergolas. Why single me out?" She shrugged. "Those have been approved. Yours haven't. And your lawnmower is louder than the permitted decibel level. We can't have neighbors disturbed by your yard work." It was surreal. I've been using that mower for weeks without complaint. Karen waved her hand dismissively. "It's been brought to my attention, and I'm obligated to act." I stared at her for a long moment, feeling a simmering rage beneath the surface. Then I took a slow breath. "Karen, if you don't leave, I'm calling the police." Again. She blinked, clearly recalling the humiliating result of her last encounter with the police. She stepped back, raising her clipboard in a defensive posture. "Threatening me won't change the fact that you're in noncompliance. I expect you to make the necessary corrections or face the penalties." She turned sharply on her heel and marched away. I stood there, staring after her. She was essentially daring me to escalate. Part of me wanted to fling open the door and hurl the official notice in her face, but I refrained. Instead, I sat down at my desk and typed up a formal email to the entire HOA board, including Dave, Kelly, and the other members whose contact info I had. I attached photos of my supposedly offensive garden trellises, noting that many other properties had similar structures. I also attached a recording of my lawnmower's noise level using a basic decibel measuring app on my phone. The results were well within normal range. Next, I penned a concise, calmly worded letter explaining that Karen was overstepping her authority, referencing the 911 stunt and the mailbox incident. I requested an emergency board meeting to address her harassment. Finally, I hit send, feeling a mixture of dread and relief. This was it. I was fighting back. In the days that followed, I kept a low profile. Winston and I continued our walks, but I avoided making eye contact with Karen whenever she was in sight. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Neighbors nodded at me sympathetically, but seemed wary of becoming targets themselves. Meanwhile, I kept checking my email for a response from the board. Nothing. No calls, no messages. It was radio silence. I should have known Karen wouldn't wait for a board meeting. She had her own plans to force my hand. What started as a petty war of letters was about to culminate in one last desperate power grab. One that would end with me, once again, face-to-face with law enforcement. A week passed with no official response from the HOA board. My frustration boiled over one sunny afternoon when, out of the blue, a white pickup truck rumbled up to my driveway. Two men in work overalls stepped out, carrying tools and measuring tape. One had a clipboard with a printed work order. I opened my door cautiously and stepped out to greet them, Winston trotting at my heels. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone polite. The older of the two men, a tall fellow with a graying mustache, glanced at his clipboard. "We're here to remove a non-compliant structure from your property," he said matter-of-factly, per the HOA's directive. Something about unauthorized garden trellises. My heart thudded. "Who gave you that order?" He tapped the paper. "Signed by a Karen, HOA Compliance Committee. All official looking." She called our office and told us to come out here. My mind reeled. The audacity. She'd hired a contractor, on the HOA's dime, or maybe even illegally on her own, to forcibly tear down my trellises. I took a deep breath, stepping between them and the backyard gate. There's been a mistake. Karen doesn't have the authority to order this. I'm not letting you onto my property. The younger man seemed uneasy. Ma'am said you'd say that. Told us to remind you the structures are in violation and that we're allowed to proceed. He glanced at Winston, who was starting to growl softly. Clearly, my dog sensed my tension. They're not in violation, I said, voice trembling with anger. And I'm asking you politely to leave before I call the police. Both men exchanged looks. The older one shrugged apologetically. We don't want trouble. We'll call our boss. They returned to their truck, leaving me seething in the driveway. While they made their call, I hurried inside to grab my phone. If Karen thought she could bully me with unauthorized contractors, she had another thing coming. As I was about to dial the non-emergency police line, I saw a flash of pink approaching in the side mirror. My stomach sank. Karen was striding up the street, phone in hand, exuding that manic sense of control I'd come to dread. She arrived in my driveway just as the contractor finished his call. I overheard him telling her, "Our boss says we need to confirm with the HOA president. We can't just tear something down without the homeowner's consent." Karen's face darkened. The homeowner is in direct violation. The HOA board has mandated this removal. She pointed a rigid finger at me. You have no right to obstruct a legally ordered correction. Stealing myself? I joined the standoff. Karen, I have emailed the board. I've heard nothing back. You're acting on your own. Unless Dave or someone with the actual authority from the board shows up in person with official documentation, these trellises are staying right where they are. For a split second, she looked genuinely furious, her cheeks turning blotchy red. She drew in a breath, then abruptly shouted, "Fine. I'm not going to stand here and argue with someone who refuses to comply. You can deal with the consequences." She whipped out her phone. You leave me no choice but to call the police again. The contractors visibly recoiled, as though they hadn't signed up for this level of drama. One of them mumbled, "Let's just wait in the truck," and they stepped away. Meanwhile, Karen glared at me triumphantly, phone pressed to her ear. For the second time in 2 weeks, she dialed 911 in front of my house, this time to report property violation obstruction. When the police arrived, this time just one cruiser, they seemed exasperated the moment they stepped out. They recognized Karen instantly. The officer, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, approached me first. "I understand there's a dispute over property structures?" I nodded, handing her a folder containing my emails, photos, and a copy of the HOA guidelines. "This is all the proof you need that my trellises are not banned. Karen is acting on her own. She even hired these contractors without my permission." The contractor corroborated my story, explaining their confusion and that they hadn't started any work. Karen interjected at every turn, claiming I was ignoring explicit HOA instructions. She insisted I was actively violating community standards and needed to be corrected immediately for the sake of neighborhood harmony. The officer read through my documentation, then quietly asked Karen for proof of her claim. Karen produced a letter with a forged-looking HOA seal. The officer tilted her head. "Is there anyone from the board we can call to verify this?" Karen tensed, then admitted, "They're at a conference. Out of town." "Well," said the officer, "until someone with actual authority from the board confirms this removal, you can't just force your neighbor to tear down his property additions. And you certainly can't call contractors to do it without his consent." "But this is a violation," Karen started. The officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, you're abusing the 911 system again. We're not here to enforce HOA guidelines, especially ones that appear to be in dispute. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. If you continue to misuse emergency services for non-emergencies, you could be charged." I could almost feel the waves of frustration rolling off Karen as she realized the officer was once again on my side. She tried to protest, but the officer wouldn't have it. "I'm going to ask you to leave his property and handle this through proper channels. If the HOA board wants these trellises removed, they can follow the legal process. Right now you're trespassing." At that final word, trespassing, Karen's face turned a peculiar shade of purple. She stood there, grappling for words, but no sound emerged. The officer gave her a pointed stare, and Karen finally spun around and marched away, shoes clacking furiously against the pavement. The contractors left soon after, apologizing for the confusion. I thanked the officer profusely for stepping in, relieved that once again the law was on my side. With that, the spectacle ended almost as quickly as it began. By dinner time, the street was quiet again, though I caught glimpses of neighbors peeping through blinds or peering from their porches, no doubt updating one another on the showdown. That night, I received an email from Dave. He just returned from the conference and was appalled by Karen's behavior. He promised an emergency board meeting the following week to officially address her overreach. True to his word, that meeting resulted in Karen's immediate dismissal from any HOA responsibilities. Several neighbors shared testimonies, citing her intimidation tactics and repeated attempts to trespass. The board censured her actions, and Dave personally apologized to me. Karen's name would linger in neighborhood lore for quite some time. While she remained a resident, her reputation never recovered. With her authority gone, she gradually faded back into the background, though I still spotted her occasionally, glowering at me from her window or shuffling through her yard with that perpetual scowl. I took quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that my marigolds continued to bloom brighter than ever, a daily reminder that some battles are worth fighting. As for Winston and me, we finally got the peaceful haven we'd hoped for. I still attend HOA meetings, if only to ensure no one else tries a Karen-style power grab. And whenever a new neighbor moves in, I go out of my way to offer a friendly wave and a piece of advice. Watch out for Karens in pink sweaters. It always gets a laugh, but there's a note of sincerity beneath it. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that true community means respecting each other's space, not patrolling it. So, if you're ever faced with your own HOA tyrant or any kind of overbearing neighbor, remember this story. Know your rights. Keep good records. Don't be afraid to stand up for yourself, even if it means making a scene. Because sometimes, the only way to deal with a self-appointed enforcer is to shine a bright light on their antics until they retreat back into the shadows where they belong.